John McNamara looked at the warning missive from the Ascended Co. Since their failed attempt at humiliating the Terran Republic 10 years earlier, and the triumph of the Republic over the Coalition, relations had not improved. On the screen beside the missive were the budgetary figures for the year. The vast expanse of new territory belonging to the Terran Republic had not yielded vast economic growth to match the territory. I swear I half think they fought a war just to make sure they got us to foot the bill for their modernization rather than themselves, John said, and watched one of his silver hairs drift down to the old ironwood desk. Beyond him, the holographic displays of the regional governors showed how humorous they found his poor attempt at humor. He didn't blame them for not laughing. Half of them were ruling over areas decimated by war, with many of their populations slaughtered down to half, with families still struggling to reunite and learn who lived and died, with the ruins of shattered buildings still cluttering vast streets of dwindled colonies, and an ever-worsening debt thanks to the high cost of the armada that won the war. There wasn't much to laugh about. The sale of bonds to fund the fleet had saved the Republic, but with the cost of providing care to over 30 million wounded and traumatized veterans, not to mention paying for the war bonds that paid for the armada and the cost of rebuilding. Debt spending was now the norm, and had been through the last administration and a half before himself. "We need more energy," he said, stating the obvious. "And we need more ships. The Ascended Co. are still a problem on the border. And need I remind you, Mr. President, if they cross over again..." The governor of the stellar south region of Borderia was, ironically, a member of the race which once worshipped the Co. as gods. After shattering the myth of the Ascended Co.'s invincibility by defeating their armada and reclaiming the lost territories, the old religion lost a lot of its perceived social and political power. There were even reports of some cultists who now deified humans, and others who believed humans were demons. The latter makes a lot more sense than the former, John thought, but he kept it as just that, a thought. The governor of the region was a pragmatist and former scientist. It made him both easier and harder to deal with. Easier in that he had no religious beliefs about humans, harder in that he was stubborn and hard to persuade. But at least he was pragmatic, though when he was right, that was the hardest thing. "I'm aware, and I intend to allocate another 40 battleships to the area. You won't be reliant on the militia system. If they cross the border, you will have enough to stop them. You're also authorized to keep a purely militaristic battle station at every hyperlane along the border." The faces of the other governors, human and non-human alike, showed their displeasure. For some it was based on politics. A fleet in the area was a representation of their region's importance, and even with the limited authority of a governor to call on them, it represented personal power. Rorona Jean was an exception to that displeasure. "I'm happy to raise a call-up of more of my people to assist the other border regions in their security, even if it be that they are stationed on the far side of the Republic. If, of course, the local governors will handle the payment of their wages." For John McNamara, Rorona Jean was both a blessing and a curse. The leader of their once most strident enemy, and the commander of their military forces, since his cousin's death and their subsequent surrender, he'd been the most ardent advocate of both peace and employment for his people. A Keynesian through and through, John thought. With their broken economy and the end of the slave trade, Rorona had pushed for his people to find employment in various government tasks, from reconstruction organizations to direct military employment. But what made him so absurdly effective is that he facilitated off-world employment for millions of his citizens in regional positions that had found prosperity in the war that shattered his formerly great empire. His citizens thus found work, disrupted nothing at home, and were taxed directly out of their automatically assessed wages that he didn't have to pay. The reduced numbers reduced needs, and so out of all the regions devastated by war, his was on the fast track to recovery. How ironic. We won the war completely, but thanks to the Co., we suffered more loss of life and property than anybody, while the ones who started the fight in the first damn place are not only going to recover fastest, but have embedded themselves into the fabric of the Republic so well and so deeply that it is difficult to imagine not having them around. Rorona's placid face betrayed nothing, but John was not about to argue, and the other prosperous regions were quick to agree with the enticing prospect. "Taxation for the reconstruction will be included, of course," John added, and the governors reluctantly bowed their heads. Paying for the devastation wrought on the core worlds was a sore point, especially with the continued debts. "What did the Co have to say this time, Mr. President?" Rorona Jean asked, shifting the subject, much to President McNamara's relief. "That we must pay for the fleet we destroyed. More of the same about our hubris and warning us not to build colonies on the unoccupied systems. Promising 1,000,000 dead for every footstep trod upon their sacred ground, that sort of thing." John rubbed his temple and wondered, did President Brown feel like this? Probably not. The man drove himself into the grave, but I swear he wasn't tired enough to die until the war was won. The fiery zealot was now all but a legend, near a deity among the liberated slaves who never imagined that anyone would fight, let alone die for them. Ordinary humans and human soldiers remembered him as the inspiring leader who guided humanity to victory through its darkest time. But John and others who had to work out the budget recalled him differently. He was a wildly impractical zealot who saw nothing but his aims and never gave a damn about the costs, and what he left behind for us to deal with was a budgetary mess and an empire so vast that unless we solve our economic situation, we'll lose it almost as fast as we got it. We're still going to cut down the size of the fleet, by the way. We simply can't afford to maintain it, and we have to eliminate a number of our star bases from the occupied regions. The cost to keep those up is even worse than the ships. We're working on new management techniques to keep administration costs down and the capacity up, but we just can't keep everything we've taken. That was the last thing the others wanted to discuss, but it beat rambling about the Co. Anger went up from every face on every hologram except for Rorona. John made a point of clearly muting them. Their shouting and raging went on regardless, until they finally got a hold of themselves and calmed down. "The border states, Ganek, Clisha, Moros, and Torrent, are too small to be a threat. Benkari are fighting a war on the other side of the border with us that shows no sign of slowing down, and none of the other states are hostile. The Co are our only true enemies, so we need to make sure we get our spending under control before the entire Republic falls into economic ruin. We can't afford your egos." John barked at them, and for a moment his rare display of temper bought him silence. He spread out his hands on the table, took a deep breath, and said, "These are temporary measures. Once we have averted this crisis, once we have restored or upgraded the infrastructure of the damaged or captured worlds, we can look at expanding beyond the core costs. So unless anybody has a suggestion for how we might manage that, this is happening." "I have one," Governor Regulus said at once. "The worlds the Co keep telling us to stay away from. They're incredibly rich systems. Very high energy output, several archaeological sites that promise to house lost technology, fantastic Gaia-quality terrain that can be quickly built up with relatively modest investment, and one even has a wormhole that will facilitate easy travel across to the far side of the galaxy. That's a lot of new trading opportunities by itself. The only real problem is the Co themselves." "Ah, yes, the only problem with rescuing the princess is the dragon that guards her, that's all," John said with a voice thick in sarcasm. "Mr. President, I hate to say it, but the truth is, this is the best possible time to act. The longer we wait, the more they will rebuild their losses. They're going to attack us anyway. Why not fight one decisive battle in a predictable place now, and then just invade and occupy their worlds? We have the fleet to manage a win, and then we'll never have to worry about the Co again. And I hate to sound callous, but every death in space is one more we don't have to keep paying for later." John McNamara clenched his jaw. The man had a point. One quick, dirty little war in an unoccupied system, a single battle, and we can then eliminate the Co forever as a threat. It definitely had its appeal, and he already knew the Terran Republic fleet could handle the Co when it was gathered into one force. "I advise against it, Mr. President," Rorona remarked. "The Co were not called gods for nothing. They have probably already recovered and rebuilt their fleet, and if you provoke them by moving into their sacred land, I can promise you they will not respond lightly." John was quiet. There was another consideration at play, too. His term was nearly up, his policies were unpopular. It was unlikely his party was going to win the next election, not unless he ended things on a high note. Like winning a war. He barely heard Rorona's objection. "The message from the Co requires an answer. I think I will give them one," he said, and cut off the comlink to end the meeting early. President John McNamara went over the objections of Rorona Jean in his mind. Despite the fact that he was from an alien race and one that was not so long ago, an enemy to not just humanity, but so many others whose names John didn't even know. He'd won the respect of a great many figures from both sides of the last war. His objections carried weight. That is their sphere of influence, and it is sacred to them. If you attempt to encroach, you will be the aggressor, and you cannot count on your neighbors to support you. Worse, they may impose penalties such as sanctions. I know from being on the receiving end of those sanctions, it makes life difficult. Besides, even weakened, the Co are a force to be reckoned with, and one that other states would love to win the favor of. It was worse because even though he couldn't admit it, John felt his pride being pricked by the fact that so many of his advisors listened to a former enemy over himself, another human. Worse, with his presidency barely begun, he could already see the writing on the wall. President Brown's accomplishment, defeating the Co, the eradication of the slave trade over a quarter of the stellar West, the liberation of 100 billion lives, and the expansion of the Republic by over 50%. They'll make hollow stories about him for hundreds of years. They'll write books enough to fill a library with historians picking over the details of his life. He'll be remembered as a great man among great men. President Chambers, they will say, began the great unification, President King. They will say he began the manifest fate. And me? They'll write that I was president after them blame me for all the debts they left for me to pay, and that will be my epitaph. Him? He came after the people who did things. That is all they'll say of me. A few new colonies within our own territory, some reconstruction. But I have no victory, I have no legacy. Just being a lesser version of the ones before. It grated, it galled, and it was 1,000-fold worse to know so many who should have sided with him were instead siding with a regional governor of a formerly independent enemy state. His hand balled up into a fist on his desk. They want to deny me a legacy. It's just a few little worlds belonging to a people we already defeated in battle once. As far as I'm concerned, those worlds should have passed to us anyway. If it weren't for President Brown's expressed wishes that peace be made when it is offered, then it would already be ours. The more he thought, the more Jonard McNamara convinced himself that the worlds on the outskirts of Co-space could be taken easily, won in a quick skirmish, and that it would serve to prove the strength of the Republic to humble the Co for the last time. Maybe we can even occupy their worlds and erase them as a regional power. There was a pleasant thought. I'll be remembered as the man who broke the back of an ancient power once and for all. He almost salivated at the thought of such a legacy. The next few weeks took time and effort. The shipbuilders of the Republic, the weapons dealers, and all of those whose business was war were quick to throw their weight behind his efforts, particularly when he promised a war profits tax of 5% instead of the previous administration's 98%. It will be a quick war. What does it matter? He reassured himself often. Building the political will to support the measure wasn't difficult either. A few stories about the ascended Co supporting their enemies, the promise of perfect Gaia worlds to be settled, and the promise that it would be over quickly. And a story about a ship being destroyed unprovoked close to the border. Didn't quite do it. It built support and noise, but not nearly enough. Confusion and procedure, however, did. Acting in my official capacity as the President of the Republic, I have the authority to do as I see fit, and in that capacity I am ordering the Armada of the Terran Republic to move in and take possession of the territories due to us as recompense for the destruction in the last war, and as a penalty for the destruction of the unfortunate ship which drifted too close to the border entirely by accident. The shock waves of the unprecedented claim to power, to declare war or seize territory, had to be hashed out in the courts and among legal scholars. And in that time, John's orders filled the power vacuum with his own desires, backed by the industrial interests of his allies. In his own mind he was convinced, I can tie up the courts for years. By then I'll have won the land, defeated the Co, and even if they rule against me, who will give up the land I've won? I'll be remembered as a strong president who expanded the strength of my office, secured our borders, crushed a truly ancient power, and they will teach children of my presidency for 1,000 years. It was a serene thought, and one that let him sleep peacefully at night. At first, Alan Mark watched the ramp descend to the ground of the planet tentatively named Megiddo. Once this belonged to the Co, now it is ours. He thought and looked to the sky. At low atmosphere, a supermassive battleship drifted, casting its shadow over the Eden of their new home. a secure wall that no force of their enemies could ever hope to breach. He thought back to his last encounter with the Co. I was just a child then, and I didn't have a ship above me except the ones that wanted me dead. I was so damn scared. Now I'm finally getting something from them that offers hope. He couldn't help but smile a little bit about that. Alan was no different than the others on his colony ship. Everybody settling the border worlds were either related to soldiers who died fending off the Co, or who lost homes or family members to them in the last war, and who wanted to start over somewhere else. The ramp touched down and he descended. The crowd of colonists shouted with glee and he shouted with them. They rushed down out of their ship, their feet sinking slightly in the soft ground. Work ahead would be hard. Every one of them knew it. But for that moment, right just then, they could enjoy it. Someone started laughing. They fell on the grass, staring at the sky and the metal behemoth overhead in whose shadow they lay, and it felt like it would never end. The ascended Co howled with rage hotter than the heat of their ancient sun. They were one voice, and that voice was full of loathing. Their message went out to every terminal and every device all over the Terran Republic. Remove yourselves, or 100,000 of you will die for every filthy footstep across our sacred worlds. I really don't advise this, Rorona Jean remarked again over the secure transmission. Don't tell me you're still superstitious about the ascended Co after all this time, the president said with a twitch of his eye. This was the fourth time the alien had objected, and what's worse, he'd convinced a large number of the other regional governors, and through them, senators and representatives, that it was also a bad idea. Or, he asked with a grim expression, is this a question of your loyalty to the Republic? No and no. My cousins were fanatics. I believe in life and death, true and false, and above all, in results. What does a god need with starships or priests? What kind of god can die? What kind of god can be bought? He shook his head and spread out his hands in the human fashion as if to share the question rather than close it. The Co are powerful, but they can die. They are mortal. They are just older than we. What matters is they are powerful and influential. The economy of the Republic took a terrible hit in the last war. All you'll do with another is compound the deficit to create enough ships to fight them. And then there's the issue of the wounded and the damage they do. If you do this, it will not be like the last war. The Co take their territorial rights very seriously. You won last time because you drowned them in your blood. They had no reason to continue after my people surrendered, and you had only one victory in 30 battles. They could end the fighting and claim they achieved their end because they did, and— Enough! The president cut him off. Taking that land will help reinvigorate our economy and avenge the dead. It's only a few worlds, and it is unlikely they'll get the help you fear they will. Besides, in a few hours, all of the Republic will clamor for war. He killed the transmission. The warning from the Co that had reached every man and woman with an electronic device to receive it had created questions about whether or not those worlds should be withdrawn from. The online boards were filled with doubts. The holocafes where people from around the Republic and the surrounding nations gathered together in virtual spaces to relax and communicate were filled with political talk. The universities and various other institutions of law were offering up questions that were difficult to answer. No treaty specified the surrender of territory. This aggressive act will damage the prestige and trust that the Republic has with its neighbor states. Ownership and active use are not synonymous. It is the right of states as much as individuals to secure their territory, even if it is not presently being settled. Why should anyone die for an empty world when there are worlds inside our territory we can still settle? But such questions seldom found their way onto the wider news net, as large-scale funding of pro-war talking points were put forth from think tanks funded by the builders of ships of war and the weapons that went with them. Rorona sat stewing over the president's last words as he saved the recording to his private files to be transcribed and archived in print, as well as audio and video. What did he mean? A faint sense of dread gnawed at his liver like a hungry beast until the question was answered a few hours later, when an emergency broadcast activated his console. 7 hours ago, the starship Tonkin was en route to New Megiddo in order to evacuate our colonists pending a resolution to the threats of the Co, when it was attacked and destroyed by a Co armada. The ship was unarmed, and its transponder identified it as a civilian transport vessel. The entire crew was lost to a man. We go live to President McNamara as he addresses the Republic Senate. The view changed at once to reflect the sea of bodies. Some were there physically. Others had only their holographic representations in place, but it was nonetheless filled with elected officials. This day will live in infamy, as the day our peaceful ship was targeted and destroyed by a rapacious and savage enemy. If this day proves anything, it is that we cannot make peace with the Co. I therefore call upon the Senate to vote now for a formal declaration of war, and let us teach the whole galaxy that when you attack one of us, you attack all of us. He pounded his fist upon the podium, and for the first time in his political career, a roar of cheers answered back. Rorona Jean shivered with every vote cast for war, and that meant he did not stop shivering for a long, long time. The vote in the end was not unanimous. Many dared to say, "This should be investigated thoroughly. We should demand an explanation from the Co as to why they did this. This doesn't make sense. Why attack a ship that was coming to do just what they wanted?" But they were shouted down as the moment carried away all rational thought in a flood of aggressive patriotism. The final tally was 980 to 20 in favor of war, all confirmed by electronic signature and biometric security confirmation. When it was over, John McNamara was silent as if he were taking in the solemnity of the moment. Now we have war, and we must fight it to the end and fight it well. To ensure victory, I submit a budget proposal that will expand the fleet to its previous levels and ask the Senate to enact the Uniform Control Clause, allowing me alone to guide the war to its conclusion. I also call upon the citizens of the Republic, of all species, to volunteer for service against this common foe. United, the Republic cannot ever be defeated. Divided, defeat is the only possible end. By day's end, the President had everything he wanted, vote after vote, bill after bill, until it was as if he alone had the right to rule. And when it did come to a close to thunderous applause, Rorona could only think to himself, he has every power he could possibly want, except the power to win easily. "I don't like this," Admiral Susan Pike said as her armada moved into position. "I don't either. But what else can we do? We can't let their fleets get out of their home system, and we can't just let them have the initiative." Admiral Nelson asked the rhetorical question while not really expecting an answer, but his former senior and current colleague went ahead and answered anyway. "We should have built up the starbases all around the border first. We could have turned all of them into citadels. I'd feel a hell of a lot more comfortable facing a co-armada if we had a fully equipped citadel at our backs. They're so arrogant that they definitely would have attacked. Then we'd have the advantage." She drummed her dark fingers on the desk in her office, and Admiral Nelson gave a respectful nod of his head to her suggestion. "That is a fair point, but I would settle for just not splitting us up, or waiting until we had a large enough armada already built up before settling those worlds." He sighed and shook his head. "But this is what the President wants, so what can we do short of launching a coup?" he asked, and both of them shook their heads at that. "I'm in position at the transit point, time to go," she said and stood up. Admiral Nelson did the same, their misgivings reflected in one another's eyes. Each one recalled the lifetime of service, victory, and hardship. From the loss of great leaders to the simple pain of losing great soldiers, all their struggles passed before their eyes in the span of a single moment, before they snapped a crisp salute to one another and said in unison, "Good luck!" The transmission died, and Admiral Nelson returned to the bridge. "Admiral Pike is in position now, too. Engage thrusters and enter the relay, and may God be with us all," he said and braced himself in his chair. The plan was simple. The Ascended Co had their power centered around 4 populated systems, supported by 2 systems of energy collectors. Each of the Co positions would be attacked by a Terran armada, and when superiority had been achieved over their worlds, the ground troops would follow and land on the same day, thus preventing any attempt at mustering a firm defense and ending their independence within 3 months of the declaration of war. Was there anyone who supported this plan? Admiral Nelson asked himself, and no names came to mind. The plan developed by the leaders of the fleet was more conservative. Lure the Co into a prepared position with established citadels, have a single amalgamated fleet on hand, destroy them, and then counter-invade, leapfrogging from world to destroy their ability to build ships, then bombard the Co into submission without landing any soldiers other than xenomorphs, and begin occupying their logistical centers until they gave in. Not bold enough. Those 3 words had damned the plan then and there, and instead they had President McNamara's plan to execute. The blur of light seemed to go on for only minutes. when in truth, outside of the faster-than-light line, weeks had passed. And when that blur of light vanished to reveal the burning ancient sun and the blackness of space, Admiral Nelson said one thing and thought another. "Fire!" he shouted, while he thought, "Forgive us." For in front of him was an arrayed fleet of 100 vessels, some of them more massive than the flagship of his armada. The Terran ships scrambled, long-range guns fired 1,000 missiles. The smaller ships raced in, unleashing hell itself in short-range fire, while the larger ships at a more languid pace did what they could to support their smaller comrades. The bright light of dying ships was blinding to the eye, and the courage of the Terran Republic's sailors earned them their places in the storied history of their people. But from the very first shot of both armadas, the end was clear. "Signal the Marines! They have to withdraw, we can buy them time!" Admiral Nelson shouted to the comm station. "Divert all power to forward weapons array, forget the engines, there's no getting out of here. It is victory or death for us." He roared as the ship shook around him as vessels began to die in turn. Behind him, the fleet of helpless troop transports began to wheel about. It would take hours for them to prime their engines to enter the relay line again, and if they failed, if the got through, it'll be a massacre. Admiral Nelson could already hear the wailing of the bereaved in his head, and nor was he alone. As if the very ship he guided shared his sense of pity, it held up. The withering fire of the battered at the shields and then at the armor, but one by one the vessels died. Just nowhere near as fast as those of his fleet. Minute died birthing minute, hour died birthing hour, and the battle raged on. "Target their starbase, draw their fire toward us. We just need a few more minutes," he shouted as the ship began to rattle and damage reports began flowing in. The transponder signals vanished as the transports jumped to warp, and Admiral Nelson smashed the all-comm line. "All ships, retreat. That is an order. Retreat!" There were few enough left to listen to the order, but for one glorious moment, it seemed less than futile. The citadel of the ascended began to list. Pieces of it began to break off, and fires erupted in 1,000 places before, in one glorious nova-like moment, it erupted into a blinding white light that reminded Admiral Nelson of the very first time he'd gone to warp and seen the blur of space passing by. His mind flew back to his childhood. "I want to go into space someday," he'd shouted to his class when asked to speak of his future career. "That's a dangerous job. You have to be very brave to do that." His teacher's answer brought a smile to the face of the young boy. "Don't worry. I will be. I promise," he'd answered, and the teacher chuckled to themselves before calling on the next child to come up and share their future hopes. And in that moment, Admiral Nelson's ship erupted. There was no more light when he proved his childhood self right. Of the 150 Republic ships to venture into space that day, only 27 returned, and of those only 9 were considered combat-ready. And except for one armada, the others were no better off. Across the Republic networks, the story spread like wildfire. 100,000 dead in triple massacres. President McNamara stared dumbly at the headline streaming across the screen. It ran on a loop, and he willed it to be different each time, but it stubbornly refused to change no matter how he cursed or what he thought or what he wanted. When he finally accepted that the words were going to refuse his will that they change, he muttered only, "Who will take the blame for this one?"